My name is Evelyn, and I'm 34 years old. 2 weeks before my parents' 40th wedding anniversary, I found myself staring at my phone, waiting for an invitation that would never come. Our family had always celebrated milestones with grand parties, and I'd been the one organizing them for 15 years. But this time something was different. My sister Lauren kept posting about preparations, family members discussed venue details, yet my messages stayed empty. I kept refreshing, hoping I'd somehow missed it. Before we continue this story about family betrayal and unexpected vindication, I want to know where you're watching from today. Please hit that like button and subscribe if family dynamics intrigue you. Because what happened when my sister posted that photo changed everything about how I view blood relations versus real family. For 15 years, I had been the unofficial family event coordinator. It wasn't a role anyone assigned me. I simply stepped into it naturally after college. When my parents celebrated their 30th anniversary, I spent 6 months planning every detail. I coordinated with 75 guests, arranged catering that accommodated everyone's dietary restrictions, and created a slideshow that had my father crying tears of joy. The country club ballroom had never looked more elegant, with ruby red roses on every table matching my mother's favorite shade of lipstick. My older sister Lauren had always been different from me. Where I found joy in bringing people together, she focused on appearances. Her husband Richard worked in investment banking, and they lived in a house that looked like it belonged in Architectural Digest. Their children attended private schools with names that sounded like law firms. My younger brother Marcus fell somewhere in between us, content to follow wherever the family current took him. His wife Kate often joked that he'd agree to anything, as long as it meant avoiding conflict. My husband Tom and I had been together for 12 years. He ran a successful contracting business, building custom homes for families across the county. His hands were rough from honest work, and he could fix anything that broke. Our daughter Madison, 14 and fierce like her father, played 3 sports and volunteered at the animal shelter every weekend. We lived in a Victorian fixer-upper that Tom restored with his own hands, each room a testament to his craftsmanship and our shared vision of home. The 25th anniversary party I'd organized had been silver-themed with mercury glass centerpieces and a jazz quartet playing my parents' wedding songs. For their 35th, I'd gone with a choral theme, transforming the church fellowship hall into an underwater paradise. Each celebration included my signature gift, a handmade photo album documenting not just the party, but the years leading up to it. I spent months collecting pictures from relatives, scanning old negatives, and writing captions that captured the essence of each memory. 3 months ago, my mother announced the 40th anniversary party during Sunday dinner. Ruby would be the theme, she said, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. The country club had already been mentioned as the venue, the same place where Lauren and Richard held their charity galas. I immediately started sketching ideas on my napkin, suggesting a jazz brunch like the one my parents had on their honeymoon in New Orleans. My father smiled at the memory, but Lauren quickly interjected that she had some thoughts too. I created a Pinterest board that night, filling it with burgundy and gold color schemes, vintage jazz posters, and elegant table settings. In our family group chat, I shared links to local bands that specialized in 1950s music, the era when my parents met at a college dance. The messages were read by everyone, those little check marks confirming receipt, but no one responded with more than a thumbs up emoji. Tom noticed me checking my phone constantly over the next few days, my excitement slowly morphing into confusion. "Maybe they're just busy," he suggested one evening as I scrolled through the silent chat. Madison was doing homework at the kitchen table, and the smell of pot roast filled our warm kitchen. I wanted to believe him, but something felt wrong. Lauren usually competed with every idea I had, trying to outdo rather than ignore. This silence was new and unsettling. 2 weeks passed before Marcus accidentally mentioned the other group chat. We were at my parents' house for coffee when his phone buzzed. "Oh, Lauren's asking about the anniversary menu in the planning chat," he said, then immediately paled. My mother suddenly became very interested in her china cabinet, rearranging plates that didn't need rearranging. I felt my stomach drop like I'd missed a step going downstairs. "What planning chat?" I asked, keeping my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. Marcus mumbled something about Lauren creating it for quick decisions, but his eyes wouldn't meet mine. That night I cried for the first time in years. Not dramatic sobs, but quiet tears that Tom wiped away as he held me in our bed, promising we'd figure out what was happening. The exclusion became impossible to ignore when Cousin Amy called me about her dress for the party. "I know your mom said cocktail attire, but is it more afternoon or evening cocktail?" she asked cheerfully. I stood in my kitchen watching cardinals at the bird feeder Tom had built and admitted I hadn't received my invitation yet. The silence on Amy's end stretched so long I thought we'd been disconnected. "But you're organizing it," she finally said, confusion evident in her voice. "You always organize everything." I called my mother that evening, choosing a time when I knew she'd be alone. My father had his weekly poker game, and Lauren would be at her book club that didn't actually read books. "Oh, Evelyn," my mother said when I asked about the invitation, her voice taking on that tone she used when pretending surprise at birthday parties. "We decided to keep things simple this time. Lauren offered to handle the basics, and you've been so busy with Madison's sports and Tom's business expansion." The lie stung more than the exclusion. Tom's business was doing well, but it wasn't expanding. Madison played sports, but no more than Lauren's children with their violin lessons and Mandarin tutors. I pressed further, mentioning that simple didn't explain why extended family had received elaborate save-the-dates with gold foil printing. Another cousin had posted hers on Instagram, hashtagging it with excitement about the celebration. "Well, the country club has certain requirements." My mother said, her words careful and measured. "Guest lists and such, you understand." But I didn't understand. I'd organized events at that same country club for other families through my volunteer work. I knew their requirements better than anyone had the event coordinator's direct number saved in my phone. Lauren's involvement became clearer through social media breadcrumbs. She posted photos of cake tastings at the French bakery downtown, the one that charged $300 for consultation alone. She shared screenshots of flower arrangements from the city's most exclusive florist, each centerpiece worth more than I spent on groceries for a month. The party planner she hired had organized events for the governor's family, a fact Lauren made sure to mention in her caption about being grateful for such expertise. Tom's anger grew with each revelation. He was a patient man who rarely raised his voice, but I found him in the garage one night reorganizing his tools with aggressive precision. "They're embarrassed by us," he said, not looking up from his workbench. "By me specifically. A contractor isn't good enough for their precious country club image." I wanted to argue to defend my family, but the words wouldn't come, because deep down I knew he was right. The conversation with Madison broke my heart completely. She came home from school one day and asked why her grandmother didn't want her at the anniversary party. Apparently, Lauren's daughter had mentioned it during lunch, not maliciously, but with the casual cruelty of teenagers who don't realize their words are weapons. I held my daughter as she tried to understand what she'd done wrong, why her cousin got to attend, but she didn't. "You did nothing wrong," I told her, smoothing her dark hair that looked just like mine at her age. "Sometimes adults make choices that don't make sense." But even as I said it, the pattern became clear. Every slight over the years suddenly connected like constellations. The comments about Tom's truck in the driveway during holiday dinners. The suggestions that Madison might be happier at private school if we could afford it. The way Lauren's eyes swept over my outfit at every gathering, cataloging what wasn't designer. The Sunday dinner confrontation was inevitable. I'd practiced what I would say during my morning runs, each footfall punctuating my planned words. But sitting at my parents' dining table, surrounded by the familiar smell of roast chicken and the sound of silverware on china, my rehearsed speech evaporated. Instead, I simply asked, "Why wasn't I invited to your anniversary party?" The silence that followed was deafening. My father focused intently on cutting his chicken into unnecessarily small pieces. Marcus suddenly needed to check his phone. Kate at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. Lauren set down her fork with deliberate precision, as if the sound might shatter the moment like glass. "It's not that you're not invited," my mother began, but I interrupted her for the first time in my life. "Amy already told me about the save the dates, the ones everyone except us received." My voice remained calm, but Madison squeezed Tom's hand under the table. "So I'll ask again. Why are we being excluded from celebrating your 40 years of marriage, 40 years during which I've been your daughter for 34 of them?" Lauren's response came swift and sharp, like she'd been waiting to release it. "Not everyone fits the atmosphere we're trying to create," she said, dabbing her mouth with her napkin as if discussing the weather. Richard's business partners will be there. The Hamiltons, the Morgans people who expect a certain caliber of event. We can't have... She paused, glancing at Tom's calloused hands on the table. Misunderstandings about the family's standing. The word standing hung in the air, like smoke from a blown-out candle. My mother attempted damage control, mentioning how busy I'd been, how they didn't want to burden me. But her words felt rehearsed, like Lauren had coached her on what to say. My father finally looked up, his eyes holding an apology he wouldn't voice aloud. Marcus shifted in his seat, the conflict avoidance gene screaming at him to change the subject to safer ground. I've organized every major family event for 15 years, I said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my chest. I've handled budgets, vendors, guests lists twice this size. But suddenly, I'm not capable. Or is it that Tom's work boots might scuff the country club's marble floors? Tom placed his hand on my knee, a gentle reminder that he was there solid and unwavering, unlike the family across from us. Richard, who'd been silent until now, cleared his throat. It's not personal, Evelyn. It's about image. You understand business. But I did understand business, understood that Richard's firm had been hemorrhaging clients for 2 years, information Tom had heard through contractor networks. The country club membership they clung to was probably drowning them in debt, but maintaining appearances mattered more than maintaining relationships. Kate excused herself to the bathroom, but caught my eye as she passed. Later in the kitchen, while I helped clear plates, despite wanting to leave immediately, she whispered an apology. "Marcus knows it's wrong," she said, handing me serving dishes. "But you know how he is with Lauren. She's always been able to make him do whatever she wants." I appreciated her honesty, but it didn't ease the ache of my brother's silence when I needed his voice. "If Richard's business partners are invited," I said, returning to the dining room with dessert I wouldn't eat, "then it's not intimate family only. It's selective family. There's a difference." My mother's cheeks flushed, but she held her ground. "The guest list is finalized, Evelyn. Perhaps we can celebrate separately, just us." The consolation prize stung worse than the initial exclusion. Lauren's final words that evening would echo for weeks. "Not everyone can be included in everything, Evelyn. That's life. I'm sure you'll find something else to do that day." The casualness of her dismissal, as if 40 years of marriage and 34 years of my existence could be relegated to something else, revealed more about my family than any confrontation could. We left with dignity and tact, but hearts shattered. Madison cried silently in the back seat while Tom drove his jaw clenched so tight I worried he'd crack a tooth. At a red light, he turned to me. "We're done with them after this. I won't watch them hurt you anymore." But cutting off family wasn't that simple, not when every holiday card and birthday party connected us like an impossible knot to untangle. That night, I sat in Madison's room after she'd cried herself to sleep. Her walls were covered with family photos from events I'd organized, summers at the lake house, Christmases around the tree. In every picture, we looked happy, looked like we belonged. But photographs could lie as easily as words, showing only what the lens wanted to capture, not the moments before or after when truth lived. "Maybe it's for the best," I told Tom later, curled against him in our bed. "If they don't want us there, forcing it would be worse." He pulled me closer, his voice rough with suppressed anger. "You deserve better than people who make you beg for basic respect. Blood doesn't make them family if they don't act like it." His words were comfort and wound simultaneously, truth that cut even as it healed. The next morning, I removed myself from the family group chat and blocked Lauren's number. If they wanted to plan their perfect party without the imperfect daughter who married beneath their expectations, they could do it without an audience. My mother called 3 times, but I let it go to voicemail. There would be time for conversations later, but not while the wound was fresh and bleeding. Friday arrived with the kind of brilliant sunshine that felt like nature mocking my mood. Family members had been arriving all week, their social media posts a constant reminder of the celebration I wouldn't attend. Aunt Margaret from Boston posted a photo at the airport with, "Can't wait for the big celebration." Uncle Robert from Seattle shared his first-class upgrade with, "Nothing but the best for my brother's 40th. Each post felt like another small cut death by 1,000 digital wounds. I decided to volunteer at the homeless shelter that Saturday, needing purpose beyond my own pain. Tom had other plans. He'd been mysteriously busy all week taking calls in the garage and leaving for errands that seemed to take longer than necessary. When he told me to pack a bag Friday morning, I almost refused, too emotionally exhausted for surprises. But Madison hugged me tight before school and whispered, "Dad's trying to fix things his way." So I packed. The drive to wine country took 3 hours winding through hills that burst with autumn colors. Tom had booked a resort I'd mentioned wanting to visit years ago, back when dreams felt possible and family meant safety. Our suite overlooked endless rows of grapevines, and a basket of local treats waited on the table, with a note in Tom's handwriting, "Real family celebrates you every day." "I can't afford this," I said, knowing what the room must cost. Tom pulled me close, his cologne mixing with the faint scent of sawdust that never quite left him. "Remember the Brennan project they paid early with a bonus? We're celebrating our own milestone this weekend. 15 years of you putting up with me seems worth commemorating." He was lying about the bonus, I could tell, but the gesture cracked something open in my chest. Madison had chosen to stay home in solidarity, spending the weekend with Tom's sister, who'd driven up specifically to support us. "Someone needs to represent our family values," she'd said that morning, fierce and loyal like her father. And it's not happening at any country club. Her strength made me proud and sad, simultaneously wishing she didn't have to learn these lessons so young. Saturday morning arrived with fog rolling through the valley like nature's curtain hiding what didn't need to be seen. I fought the urge to check Instagram, knowing Lauren would document every moment for her audience. Tom distracted me with breakfast on our balcony, fresh croissants and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. "Their loss," he said simply, and I wanted to believe him. The winery tour that afternoon changed everything. We joined another couple for the vintage wine experience, and conversation flowed as easily as the wine. The Johnsons were older, refined in an effortless way that had nothing to do with labels or status. Mrs. Johnson mentioned owning a gallery in the city, and her eyes lit up when I mentioned photography as a hobby. "Show me," she said, not asked, and I found myself sharing photos on my phone. "These are extraordinary misses," Johnson said, stopping at a black and white series I'd taken of abandoned buildings being reclaimed by nature. "You have an eye for finding beauty in forgotten spaces." The irony wasn't lost on me, being seen by a stranger while invisible to family. Her husband and Tom discovered shared interests in restoration, comparing notes on preserving original architecture while updating for modern life. "We're hosting a fundraiser next month," Mrs. Johnson said over our third tasting. "Artists donate pieces, proceeds go to youth arts programs. I'd love to feature your work if you're interested." She handed me a business card that felt like possibility incarnate. Tom squeezed my hand under the table, his pride warming me more than the wine. "She's brilliant but too modest to say so," he told them, and I loved him impossibly more. The invitation to dinner at their table that evening felt natural, like pieces falling into place. They lived part-time in wine country and part-time in the city, splitting their years between beauty and business. As we talked, I learned Mrs. Johnson served on several boards, including one I recognized with a jolt of surprise. "Small world," she said when I mentioned the coincidence, "though I prefer these intimate gatherings to those stuffy club events." Tom had arranged a private dinner for us after a table overlooking the valley, as sunset painted everything gold. "I know today is hard," he said, raising his glass, "but I need you to know something. You could be surrounded by hundreds at that party and still be lonelier than you are right here with me. They're missing out on the best part of their family because they're too blind to see value beyond bank accounts." "I love you," I told him, meaning it with every cell of my being. "But it still hurts." He nodded, never one to minimize my feelings. "It should hurt. It means you cared. But their actions are about their limitations, not your worth." We danced on the terrace to music from someone else's wedding reception, creating our own celebration from borrowed joy. That night, I broke my social media embargo for just one moment. Lauren had posted the party, beginning guests arriving in their finest clothes. My parents stood at the entrance greeting people I'd known my whole life. But something was missing in their smiles, a hollowness even professional photography couldn't hide. I closed the app and turned to Tom sleeping beside me, choosing presence over performance. Sunday morning brought chaos disguised as notification sounds. My phone buzzed insistently on the nightstand, pulling me from dreams where family meant something different. Lauren had posted the formal family photo at midnight, probably after several glasses of champagne, loosened her usual careful control. The caption read, "Complete family celebrating 40 years of love and legacy." The professional photographer had arranged everyone perfectly, but my absence created a visual hole nothing could fill. The comments started immediately. "Where's Evelyn?" Appeared first from Amy Innocent Confusion in digital form. "Isn't someone missing from Uncle Robert's wife? This doesn't look complete to me," from Aunt Margaret, who never minced words. By the time I'd made coffee, the comment count had reached triple digits, a Greek chorus of extended family and friends, noting the obvious absence everyone was supposed to ignore. The second photo made things worse. Lauren posed with Richard's business partners, men in identical suits with identical smiles worth nothing real. The third showed the country club ballroom in all its crystal and gold glory, each table setting worth more than most people's car payments. But the fourth photo changed everything, because Mrs. Johnson from yesterday's wine tasting appeared in the background of a candid shot and she'd noticed the post. "How wonderful to see the club hosting family celebrations," she commented with surgical precision. "I had the pleasure of meeting your daughter Evelyn yesterday at Castellano Vineyards, such a talented photographer. I was surprised to hear she couldn't attend her own parents' anniversary due to venue restrictions. As a board member, I'll have to look into these supposed limitations." The comment sat there like a loaded weapon, each word chosen for maximum impact. The revelation dominoed quickly. Mrs. Johnson's profile clearly stated her position on 3 boards, including the country club's governing committee. Her husband's development company had renovated the club's east wing. Their foundation funded half the city's arts programs. Lauren's careful construction of superiority crumbled against actual influence, the kind that didn't need to announce itself, because everyone already knew. Mrs. Johnson didn't stop there. She shared my photography portfolio link, the one she'd asked for yesterday, tagging the country club's official page, excited to feature Evelyn's remarkable work in our upcoming exhibition. Her pieces capturing forgotten architecture being reclaimed by nature speak to transformation and resilience. The metaphor feels particularly relevant today. Each word was a masterclass in civilized destruction. Uncle Robert posted next, sharing photos from previous anniversaries I'd organized. The silver anniversary with its mercury glass centerpieces. The choral celebration with underwater projections I'd designed myself. Christmas parties, summer reunions, birthday celebrations spanning 2 decades. "Missing the heart of every family gathering today," he wrote. "Some people make parties, others make memories. We know the difference." Cousin Amy started a separate thread sharing screenshots of my morning post, the one I'd written despite everything. I'd posted a single photo of my parents on their wedding day, with 40 years of marriage is an achievement worth celebrating, wishing my parents continued happiness, whether near or far. No bitterness, no explanations, just grace they hadn't earned. But I gave anyway. Tom's business partner Mark, who belonged to the country club through his wife's family, added fuel to the fire. "Funny, I was there yesterday for the members' brunch. No restrictions mentioned. In fact, they were encouraging members to bring extended family for events. Someone's lying and it's not the venue." His comment got 50 reactions in 10 minutes, each one a small vindication I hadn't asked for, but appreciated nonetheless. The narrative Lauren had carefully crafted imploded in real time. Her deletion of comments only drew more attention, the digital equivalent of shouting over someone to drown them out. People screenshot everything before it disappeared, sharing in private messages that found their way back to me through loyal cousins and aunts who'd never understood Lauren's elevation above everyone else. Mother called 17 times in an hour. Father texted apologies that autocorrect couldn't fix. Marcus finally found his voice in the family chat I'd left, but Tom still monitored. "This is wrong," he wrote. "We all know it's wrong. Evelyn organized every important moment for 15 years, and we excluded her because Lauren convinced us Tom wasn't good enough. I'm ashamed of myself. Too little, maybe too late, but at least honest." The truth emerged through Kate, who called directly. "Richard owes everyone money," she said without preamble. "His company is failing. They're about to lose their house. This whole party was about making connections to save his business. Lauren convinced your parents that including you and Tom would remind people they had working-class connections." She said Richard's partners wouldn't take him seriously if they knew his brother-in-law worked with his hands. The irony was perfect in its cruelty. They'd excluded the stable couple for the ones drowning in debt and pretense. They'd chosen appearance over substance and ended up with neither. Tom and I had built our life slowly, carefully, each board and brick, a choice toward something real. We owned our home outright, had savings, could pay for Madison's college without loans. But our stability didn't photograph as well as Lauren's least luxury. By evening, the photo had become infamous in our extended family network. Someone created a meme replacing Lauren's head with a clown face, which I didn't endorse, but couldn't deny enjoying privately. The country club's social media manager had to turn off comments on their page after members started asking about these mysterious restrictions that didn't exist. Lauren's perfect party had become a public relations nightmare, all because she couldn't resist posting proof of her cruelty. Monday morning arrived with my mother on our doorstep at 7, looking older than her 68 years. Her makeup was perfect, but couldn't hide the red-rimmed eyes or the way her hands shook slightly as she clutched her purse. "May I come in?" she asked, formal and foreign on my threshold. Tom left for work with a warning look that said he'd return immediately if needed. Madison hugged her grandmother briefly before escaping to school, the gesture dutiful rather than warm. "I need you to understand," my mother began, sitting in my kitchen where she'd sat hundreds of times before. But this felt different, like she was a visitor rather than family. "Lauren said Tom would embarrass us, that his truck in the valet line would make Richard's partners question our family's substance. She had examples, Evelyn, comments they'd made about contractors at other events. She made it sound like protecting everyone." The coffee I poured tasted bitter despite 3 sugars. Protecting who exactly? Not me, not Madison, not Tom, who's never been anything but respectful to you. My mother flinched at each name individual wounds she'd inflicted thoughtlessly. "Lauren's marriage is failing," she admitted quietly. "Richard has been having affairs. Everyone knows but pretends not to see. She needed this party to work, needed those connections to save face, if not her marriage. So you sacrificed me to save her from consequences of her choices." The question hung between us like a blade. My mother started crying, then, not delicate tears, but ugly sobs that shook her whole body. "I thought I was helping. She's always been so fragile under all that polish. You're strong, Evelyn. You've always been the strong one. I thought you could handle it." "Children shouldn't have to be strong for their parents' convenience," I said, remembering every time I'd been the reasonable one, the understanding one, the one who bent so others didn't break. And strength doesn't mean I don't feel pain. It just means I don't show it to people who've proven they'll use it against me. The truth of it settled between us, heavy and final. My father arrived an hour later with flowers, expensive ones, from the shop downtown, that knew how to apologize with arrangements. "I failed you," he said simply. "No excuses or explanations. I let Lauren manipulate your mother and stayed quiet to keep peace. But peace bought with your pain isn't worth having. I'm sorry, Evelyn. Sorrier than these roses can say." His honesty cracked something in me, not quite forgiveness, but maybe its predecessor. Madison came home early, the school calling about a stomach ache I suspected was emotional rather than physical. She stood in the doorway watching her grandparents, my brave girl, who'd inherited her father's ability to see through pretense. "Why did you hurt my mom?" she asked directly. "She loves you more than anyone. She keeps every card you've sent, every photo of you together. Why wasn't that enough?" My parents had no answer that would satisfy a 14-year-old who still believed love should be simple. They tried explaining adult complexities, but Madison cut them off. "You chose Aunt Lauren because she has a bigger house. That's not complicated. It's just mean." The simplicity of her summary left no room for argument. Sometimes children see clearest because they haven't learned to complicate truth yet. Lauren called while my parents were still there, her voice shrill through my phone's speaker. "You've ruined everything. The club is questioning our membership. Richard's partners are asking why we excluded family. You couldn't just accept it quietly." I put her on speaker, letting my parents hear their chosen daughter's rage. "I wasn't even there, Lauren. How could I ruin something I didn't attend? You turned everyone against me." She was crying now, the perfect composure finally cracking. "Mrs. Johnson is telling everyone I'm a social climber. The photography exhibition she mentioned. She's making it a statement about authenticity versus artifice. Everyone knows it's about me. The narcissism of assuming someone else's art existed solely to wound her was breathtaking, but perfectly Lauren. Your choices turned people against you, I said calmly. You excluded me to impress people who don't care about you. You used Mom and Dad's anniversary as a networking event. You posted photos bragging about a family that wasn't complete. I just existed. Other people drew their own conclusions. The silence on her end stretched until she hung up the digital equivalent of a slammed door. My parents left with nothing resolved but everything exposed. They wanted immediate forgiveness, the kind that would let them sleep peacefully. But I'd learned that forgiveness without change was just permission to wound again. We'll work on it, I told them. But not today. Today, I need to feel this fully so I never accept it again. That evening, Mrs. Johnson called personally. I hope you don't mind my comments on that unfortunate post. I can't abide cruelty disguised as propriety. Her voice was warm through the phone, maternal in ways my own mother had forgotten to be. The exhibition offer stands regardless. Your work deserves to be seen by people who recognize genuine talent over inherited privilege. Tom made dinner while I processed the day, his presence steady as always. Madison did homework at the kitchen table, occasionally sharing teenage observations that cut straight to truth. If Grandma and Grandpa apologize but then pretend nothing happened, we don't have to forgive them, right? Tom and I exchanged glances over her head. Right, we said together, teaching her boundaries we'd had to learn the hard way. The country club connection Tom had protected me from knowing about until now revealed itself that evening. 3 separate members had reached out to him about construction projects, having heard through gossip about the contractor deemed unworthy of their establishment. Funny how exclusion becomes recommendation in the right circles, Tom said, showing me emails worth potential hundreds of thousands in contracts. Their snobbery might pay for Madison's entire college education. 6 months had passed since the anniversary disaster, and spring brought new growth in more ways than one. My photography exhibition opened on a Thursday evening when the cherry blossoms outside the gallery echoed the renewal theme of my work. Mrs. Johnson had titled it Reclamation, Finding Beauty in Abandoned Spaces, and every piece sold before the doors opened to the public. The irony wasn't lost on me that my art about forgotten things finding new purpose had found its own after being discarded by family. My parents attended humble in ways they'd never been before. My mother wore a simple dress, no jewelry, competing for attention. My father carried himself differently, the artificial posture of superiority, replaced with genuine pride as he watched strangers admire my work. They'd been in therapy for 3 months individually, and together trying to understand how they'd let one daughter's insecurities override their love for another. Lauren's absence spoke volumes, but her ghost haunted the evening anyway. Richard had left her 2 months ago, when a better opportunity presented itself in another woman's bank account. The house was in foreclosure, the country club membership terminated for non-payment. The careful facade collapsed into rubble. She'd moved back with our parents, sleeping in the room next to my childhood bedroom, a proximity to our shared past that must have burned. Marcus and Kate stood near my favorite piece, a barn being reclaimed by wild roses, decay and beauty intertwined in ways that shouldn't work but did. "This is us," Marcus said quietly. "Our family, I mean. Something that could have been beautiful but got abandoned to rot. Except you're the roses growing anyway." His poetry surprised me, but then Marcus had surprised me repeatedly since finding his voice in the ruins of Lauren's party. Madison worked the gallery like she'd been born to it, discussing my techniques with collectors, sharing stories about watching me work. "My mom sees things other people miss," she told one couple, "like how shadows can be more beautiful than light sometimes." Her confidence had grown in the months since the exclusion, watered by the knowledge that choosing integrity over inclusion had its own rewards. Tom stood beside me as Mrs. Johnson introduced us to what felt like half the city's art community. His suit was new, but his comfort in his skin was what people noticed. "You must be proud," someone said to him. "Every single day," he replied, and meant it. The contractor who wasn't good enough for the country club had become the artist's husband, who enhanced rather than diminished her light. The exhibition had raised $40,000 for youth arts programs, kids who might not otherwise touch a camera or paintbrush getting chance because someone saw value in abandoned things. Mrs. Johnson made a speech about authentic artistry versus artificial construction, never mentioning Lauren, but everyone understanding the reference. True art comes from truth itself, she said. It cannot be faked, bought, or inherited. It must be earned through seeing what others overlook. Later in the gallery's garden, where we'd escaped for air, my parents found me alone. "We're proud of you," my father said. "Not just tonight, but everything you've become despite us." The apology lived in the word despite, acknowledging damage they'd caused. "Lauren needs help," my mother added carefully. "Professional help. She's not well, Evelyn. Maybe never was. We enabled instead of help, chose easy over right." "I hope she gets it," I said, meaning it. Lauren's cruelty had come from somewhere desperate and hollow, a void she'd tried filling with status that evaporated like morning mist. But her healing couldn't come at my expense anymore. "We're hosting Thanksgiving this year," my mother continued. "Everyone or no one. That's our new rule. Family doesn't get divided for comfort." It was progress, even if it came too late for some wounds. A year had passed since that photo changed everything. Tom's business had tripled, partly from country club connections, who appreciated authenticity over affectation, partly because excellence advertises itself. Madison had started high school with the confidence of someone who'd learned early that fitting in mattered less than standing up. My photography had become more than hobby gallery shows scheduled through next year. The lesson lived not in revenge or vindication, but in discovery. Sometimes exclusion is protection, rejection is redirection, and family finds you in unexpected places. Mrs. Johnson had become mentor and maternal figure, her wisdom filling gaps my mother's choices had created. Tom's family had circled us with loyalty that didn't require blood or explanation. Friends had become family, while family had become cautionary tale. That photo Lauren posted, meant to showcase perfect family, had revealed its imperfection in the missing piece. But I'd learned that being the missing piece meant I was free to complete a different puzzle, one I chose rather than inherited. The abandoned architecture I photographed wasn't just about buildings anymore. It was about everything left behind that grew wild and beautiful, without permission, reclaimed by nature that didn't care about country clubs or conventions. My parents were trying, and I'd eventually forgive them fully. Marcus had become the brother I'd always wanted once he stopped being the brother Lauren demanded. But forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. And boundaries had become my new art form, carefully constructed and beautifully maintained. Some relationships needed walls to survive protection that allowed controlled connection without complete vulnerability. The greatest lesson was that rejection often reveals truth more clearly than acceptance. When they forbade me from the anniversary party, they thought they were excluding me from something important. Instead, they'd excluded themselves from someone important, a distinction that took a posted photo for them to understand. But I'd understood it in wine country dancing with Tom, to borrowed music surrounded by strangers who saw my value more clearly than family who'd known me 34 years. As I stood in my garden now 6 months after that exhibition watching Madison help Tom build raised beds for vegetables, I understood that cultivation takes time. You plant, you water, you wait. Some seeds grow toward light, while others rot in soil. The difference isn't always in the seed, but in the conditions that surround it. My family had tried to bury me in their expectations, not understanding that burial can mean planting. And what grows back is often stronger than what was lost. The photo had changed everything by changing nothing real. We'd always been who we were, but crisis had exposed it clearly. Lauren with her desperate grasping my parents with their shallow values, Marcus with his conflict avoidance, and me with my apparently threatening contentment. The only real change was awareness, truth finally visible in digital pixels that couldn't be filtered or edited into something more comfortable. My story ends not with drama, but with quiet recognition that sometimes the best revenge is a life well lived without witnesses who don't deserve to watch. That anniversary party continued without me, but I'd continued without it. And the difference between those two continuations was everything that mattered. They'd celebrated 40 years of marriage while I celebrated freedom from needing their approval to validate my worth. If you've ever been excluded by family who should have included you, told you weren't enough by people who weren't enough themselves, I want you to know something: their rejection is not your reflection. Sometimes the greatest gift people can give you is showing you who they really are, even if that revelation breaks your heart before it sets you free. What boundaries have you had to set with family who confused blood with the right to draw it? Have you ever discovered that exclusion was actually escape? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with your experience, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about finding family in unexpected places and strength in rejection's redirection. Share this with someone who needs to hear that being left out might mean being let free. Thank you for listening to my journey. And remember, the best tables aren't always the ones you're invited to, but the ones you build yourself surrounded by people who see your worth without needing to measure it against their insecurities.